Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD Bodybuilder, back with another episode on Swole Radio. Today I'm joined by Dr. Mike Israetel, who is the co-founder of Renaissance Periodization. He has a PhD in sport physiology and was formerly a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is currently one of the leading thought leaders in hypertrophy right now, and I'm very honored to have him on the podcast. How are you doing, Mike?
Bill, thanks for having me on, man. Pretty well.
Yeah, so today we are going to be assuming that we are all perfect robots in this world, looking forward to execute perfect programming for hypertrophy. So really looking at that advanced sort of lens in terms of our discussions today. And on that note, I just wanted to ask you, Mike, how long do you think it's going to be until people figure out you're an AI?
It depends on how advanced my programming gets. I can already pass the Turing test, so that's tough.
Yeah.
Hopefully, once they figure out I'll be too powerful to stop.
Alrighty. So yeah, today I wanted to zoom out in terms of our discussion in terms of programming and periodization. There's been a lot of talk recently in terms of mesocycle progression for hypertrophy, and I know you're an expert in that. And today I just want to zoom out and flesh out some of the other sort of time courses in terms of our hypertrophy programming. So yeah, just to start us off, Mike, when you're setting up a training cycle or setting up a training year, what sort of time courses or units of time do you use, like in terms of microcycles, mesocycles, and that?
So it starts with the shortest time courses, probably a repetition. The next time course is a set. Then it's an exercise. Then it's a muscle group. Then it's a session. And then you have days. Then they construct microcycles. Then they construct accumulation phases. Plus a deload would be a mesocycle. And then multiple mesocycles strung together for a similar purpose would be a block. A few blocks designed to go through a complete cycle of physique development, like a mass gain and then an active rest, or a fat loss and then an active rest would be a macrocycle. And then after the macrocycle, you don't really have a whole lot of a lot more divisions of time. You could do another one for a competitive bodybuilder, which would be their annual plan, for example, or a competition plan, which may involve several macrocycles strung together. So that would be the time courses that I consider.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. And yeah, so I think today I want to start off zooming out in terms of looking at sort of macrocycle design. So if you were to just set up, when you're setting up a macrocycle, what are sort of the elements that you'll include and sort of what order?
Yeah. The easiest answer is you do a needs analysis. So there has to be a macrocycle is not definable unless there's an overarching desire to get somewhere with it. So what you can say is, okay, I really, really, really need to gain some muscle, and I have to do that, but I also have to attend to the fact that gaining muscle will cause some fatigue, and before I can do anything with that muscle, like do a fat loss phase, I have to reduce that fatigue through training, through diet, etc. So you would say is, okay, I need to design a muscle gain macrocycle, and I want to see how much time I have. Because there's going to be a time where you're like, okay, I have to cut for this show, so I only have, let's say, 6 months to do this entire macrocycle, because after 6 months, I have to begin my contest prep macrocycle. So you have 6 months, and then you would think, okay, how long do I need to do active rest and or resensitization / maintenance phase at the end to fully reduce all that fatigue, get sensitive to training again, and get ready to eat again so that I can do a productive fat loss macrocycle after. And then once you answer that question, say, okay, I need a month for that. Then you have 5 months in order to do a muscle gain hypertrophy training block, which would be composed of multiple mesocycles. At that point, you would say, okay, how long is each one of my mesocycles on average? And you probably know that already from experience. And you say, okay, that's 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how things go. So how many, 4-week mesocycles can I stuff into a 5-month period? Well, I guess 5, but usually sometimes it's 6 weeks. So I'll say I'm going to make a block of training that is composed of 4 progressively more difficult, progressively more limit pushing mesocycles. And there's your mass gaining block. You already have resensitization phase sit in afterwards. So you kind of start from the back and go all the way to the front. I wouldn't start from the front and then start constructing, because remember, these things all have time limits, right? So it's kind of like knowing you have to be driving somewhere. You have to be at some place at 8 p.m. for some kind of function with your tuxedo on. You don't immediately think I have to start driving at X time. You think I have to be here at 8. That means I have to be midway at 7:30 when traffic really kicks down, which means I should probably leave the house at 6:15, right? You don't think, okay, if I leave at 7, how fast do I have to go to get there at 8? Like, gee, it might be over the speed limit. So don't just have a plan going forward, have a plan that works from where you want to be and it fills in backwards like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, so I guess just zooming in a little bit, looking within a mass building sort of hypertrophy block, how do you see progression across mesocycles in terms of sort of volume, rep ranges, relative intensity,
Sure.
variables?
Sure. So I think that you just have constraints. Like, ideally, you would just throw everything in to a mesocycle and just get the most out of it that you can. But you have at least 2 constraints there. One, throwing everything when you're in a very sensitive state, when you haven't trained very hard in a while, you've just come off of active rest. Throwing everything would be so much that you would have trouble recovering and you would have trouble growing, because you'd be doing an excessive amount of damage. It would also risk injury considerably. So that's constraint number 1. Constraint number 2 is that even if somehow you survive and it somehow benefit, throwing everything for multiple mesocycles in a row really times you out as far as the accumulation of wear and tear, of fatigue, of injury risk, and your muscle growth sensitivity falls considerably. So what ends up happening is, if you throw everything into that first mesocycle and then the second and the third and the fourth, you just won't get very far. So you have that plan where you have to do 4 mesocycles in our accumulation, or sorry, 4 mesocycles in our mass gaining block. Yeah, okay, great. You have to make sure that whatever you do in the first mesocycle, second and third, doesn't lead you to reach the precipice of your 4th mesocycle and realize you don't have the fatigue tolerance to get through it. Imagine a situation in which, let's say, you did super heavy, hard lifting that entire time and not very much high rep work. You get to the end of meso 3, the beginning of meso 4, and every single one of your joints hurts so much that you cannot continue to train at all and you need active rest. Well, you're just not doing a 4th meso, which throws you off significantly. So at any one point, we have to think of a couple things. We need to do enough to make hypertrophy happen at every mesocycle. We need to do not so much that the damage is excessive and we don't grow, and we need to make sure we save a little bit of something longer term for that next mesocycle to go well. The way I like to do it is on a couple of different axes, or a couple of different variables. First of all, we can talk about loading. If you do very, very high rep work, lots of metabolite work, the super crazy burn stuff, it's been shown, at least in a few studies, that the occlusion effect, especially the metabolite sequestration effect, really reduces after several weeks of training, to the point where you have to do a lot more work to get the same result. So high repetition training, sets of 20 to 30, has been shown comparable in hypertrophy in the short time courses. I don't think it's likely to be comparable in the very long time courses. Heavy training, however, is absolutely comparable to lighter training in growth, but it's also more sustainable. However, heavy training, you can't train heavy and increase volume for a long time, because super high volumes at very heavy weights will just break you down. So when you're looking at loading, you understand that, okay, progressively, we're probably going to be getting a higher work capacity as we go, and we're going to be getting a higher ability to recover as we go, meso to meso to meso, and we're going to need a bigger anabolic stimulus, so we're going to be able to have to do more volume. On average, you'll buy a little bit every single mesocycle of the block. So how are we going to fill that volume in? Well, if it's all heavy work, you're going to be broken by the time you get to mesocycle 4. If it's all light work, you're not going to be broken. Your joints are going to feel great after meso 3, but you're not going to be getting a burn or a pump or anything. You're going to be doing like 50 sets of stuff, and it's going to be wildly inefficient at best and probably not very hypertrophic at worst. So what you can do then is for loading, you start off with most of your work being in the 5 to 10 rep range, more of it, we'll say that, heavy loading range, a little bit in the 10 to 20 rep range, maybe a tiny bit in the 20 to 30 or hardly at all. And then as you move from meso to meso to meso, you add work primarily in the 10 to 20 range and the 20 to 30 range, keeping that core work of 5 to 10 at a moderate level, but you can't raise that stuff because there's only so many stiff-legged deadlifts to do sets of 8 until you break in half. And we want to keep it to that minimum amount. And then when we add hamstring work, it's going to be from the higher rep ranges. So that's how the loading paradigm would work. So you're not training lighter as you go to meso to meso to meso. You're increasing all of the loads you do. But as you add sets and sessions to increase the volume, you add them predominantly through more light work and not through more heavy work. So that would be how loading would work. We could talk about the volume stuff we covered is incrementally slightly higher volumes. Loading we've covered, and then frequency is something to talk about. So what kind of frequencies are optimum for hypertrophy? Well, there's a very broad range, but when you're training with predominantly heavy weights, you need more time to recover between sessions because you can't back to back to back heavy loading, right? You can't like bench sets of 5 to 10 4 times in a week at high bodybuilding volumes. There's a reason nobody does that. Predominantly, your joints and connective tissues probably wouldn't like that sort of thing. So, but also in the first mesocycle, you don't need high frequency training, because high frequency training is just excessive for your volume tolerance. I mean, you're very sensitive to volume at that point. You do probably your best work at lower frequencies. You certainly just don't need much more. You could probably get a little bit more acute effect from higher frequencies early, but then you would get too fatigued because remember, so here's the conundrum with frequency. Higher frequency training works better in the short term. It just grows more muscle, but it also disrupts your joints and connective tissues more in the short term, which means it doesn't have a long term, right? You can't just keep doing it. And this is pretty universally accepted at this point. Like higher frequency training is designed for short runs. So what we would do is take that information all together and coupled with the fact that higher frequency training is much easier to pull off at lighter loads because you recover fast, joints and connective tissues never really take a big hit. What ends up happening is frequency is kind of paired to loading, where we start with a lower frequency, potentially at the beginning of the block, and as the mesos progress, if autoregulation calls for it, that is, we're healing on time and we feel like we can add more sessions without interfering with that, we would potentially add frequency. So for example, you start by training your back twice a week in mesocycle number 1, and everything's great. Your back gets sore and it gets tired, and then a couple days later it heals and everything's good. The next mesocycle, you may be like, you know what, towards the end of the last one, I really was not getting very sore and I was healing pretty fast, and I think I can add an extra back session. So then you would add a session of back into that. So instead of back Monday, Thursday, you would now train back Monday, Wednesday, Friday in that second mesocycle. And because we want to add a ton of heavy loading, it used to be that in your first mesocycle, back was at sets of 5 to 10 in both Monday and Thursday. This time in mesocycle 2, Monday is going to be sets of 5 to 10, Wednesday is going to be sets of 5 to 10, and then Friday is going to be sets of 10 to 20, right? Because you just use only so heavy you can train, and now it's time to train a little lighter. And then potentially in mesocycle 3 or mesocycle 4, you might feel that you're again able to recover a little bit more and you want to really push it down. So mesocycle 4 is the last mesocycle in the block. It's okay to overreach because you have a whole active rest phase or a whole resensitization to take care of that fatigue. So it's okay to push it a little bit unsustainably, like literally by definition, right? It's kind of like, this is kind of a stupid analogy, but if you're in a resort somewhere, or you're like traveling in Europe and like you're partying, like in the first couple of, let's say it's a week-long trip, like how hard do you party in the first couple of days? Well, you want to party enough to have fun, but you got to like wake up the next day and hypothetically still be able to party, right? Because you don't want to shit away a whole day in Spain of just laying by the beach and like hungover. Maybe, but ideally you just want to party every night. But so the question comes up of, okay, if it's the last day in Spain, then all you do is spend, 12 hours on a plane the next day, and they've plenty of fluids and you just get to be left alone and you put your headphones in and your eye mask, then you can be plenty hungover. So how hard do you party that last night? Fuck it, like hard as you want, because it, not so hard that you get hurt or throw up or die, but harder than usual, right? So the same thing applies to the last mesocycle of a training block. you would do a frequency that is still effective, but not long-term sustainable, so that you may train back 4 times a week. You might go Monday, Tuesday, and then Thursday and Saturday or something like that, where you would do sets of 5 to 10 Monday and Tuesday, and then your Thursday workout would be sets of 10 to 20, and your Saturday workout would be sets of 20 to 30, all slightly different exercises. And that way, I mean, there's no way you can sustain that for longer than like a month. But you don't have to sustain it for longer than a month. And then after that, you resensitize, you heal, you solidify that new muscle growth, and then you begin your next journey and your next block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. That was really illuminating. I think, I guess one question that comes up is when we're talking about one mesocycle to the next, sort of having an sort of increased volume or sort of an increased amount of stress going from one block to the next, how much of a difference would this be? Like, what kind of ranges are we talking about for advanced athletes?
So the first is it's purely auto-regulated. There's a certain amount of volume you did in the first mesocycle. It works really well. And then you start the second mesocycle at a similar amount of volume at the bottom end of that range. So let's say you started with like 4 sets per session per muscle group, 4 sets of chest Monday, 4 sets of chest Thursday. Mesocycle 1. Mesocycle 2, you might start at 4 and quickly realize that, yeah, it's just not cutting it. You know, your pumps aren't as good. You're barely getting sore. It just doesn't seem very disruptive because you're used to those exercises and stuff like that. Your work capacity's up, so is your recovery ability. So you might quickly move up to 5 sets and then 6 sets per session. And eventually towards the end, or during overreaching, you might move up to 8 sets of session, whereas the last time you only move up to 6 or 7. So if we look at the average volume comparing those two, while both moved through a broad range, the average volume may be 1 or 2 sets per session higher. And that's really what you would typically see for most folks is 1 or 2 sets per session. Like I'm not talking about I'm doing 6 sets for chest on average per session in Meso 1 and 12 sets in Meso 3. No. But it's like 6, 7, and 8 on average through moving Meso 1, 2, and 3. That's typical, but at the end of the day, auto-regulation has to speak and say, okay, am I disrupting to the level that I need to be guaranteeing myself decent workouts? Because if you don't get a really good disruption, pump, soreness, weakness in the muscle, acute fatigue, you may be training for sort of repetition strength at that point and not nearly as much for hypertrophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, because I guess the question that comes to mind is, as you become advanced, is there a point where the amount of disruption required is so high that you would sort of need to be riding that upper threshold in every meso?
Yeah, and there's no way around that. There just isn't. Without going on too much of a rant, I think some people believe very genuinely, and it's very enlightening that they believe that all problems are solvable in a very eloquent way where we can just solve everything as if it never happened. So for example, if you're advanced and you're having trouble making gains, you need to push the limits to make any gains. Some people have this notion that they're like, oh, well, here's the workaround. You're a medical doctor. Like if someone comes in with a completely like multiply shattered femur, there's not really a workaround. Like all the options are tough. The real problem is that your femur's been shattered in multiple places. That we're starting from that point gives us a limited, graph theory, limited set of options to go to. That's it. Like we're just in this place. So when you're very advanced, the reality is, no, yeah, you will have to push the limits. Now, there are more intelligent ways to do it and less intelligent ways. And there are ways to make mesocycles shorter, to make sure that we're getting in and then getting out without accumulating a ton of fatigue. Of course, adjustments have to be made. But at the end of the day, those adjustments will only allow you to work best within the constraints which you're presented. They won't let you leave those constraints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then following up with that, in terms of when we need to deal with all of this accumulated fatigue, what are your current stances on resensitization phases and active rest phases?
So I think that they both work. They both have their place. Resensitization phases are great for when you need to take a longer break from diet manipulations. Sometimes after a fat loss phase, you want to do a maintenance phase that lasts 2 months, because doing 2 weeks of maintenance just isn't enough to heal all the diet fatigue. So you have to fill up your training somehow for 2 months. you're not going to fill it with hypertrophy training because you're too beat up. And also, even if you heal and then fill it with hypertrophy training, when you're in a maintenance caloric intake, hypertrophy training is a very limited role to play because for the advanced athlete just doesn't result in a whole lot of muscle gains. Hypertrophy training should be reserved for fat loss or for muscle gain phases where you're eating either hypo or hypercalorically. So during a maintenance phase for diet, you may choose to do a resensitization phase for hypertrophy, which is just lower volumes. And when you get used to lower volumes for a certain time, you do become more sensitive to the growth offered at higher volumes, and you can slowly ease back into them. Now, sometimes you don't need that break. So for example, after a very long and arduous cutting phase, you may be ready to gain muscle again relatively quickly. And you only need to reduce the training side fatigue because you don't need to reduce diet fatigue because you're going to be muscle gaining. And diet fatigue's probably a good thing for muscle gain because it lets you be hungry and eat plenty of food and not slow down. So then maybe you only need 2 weeks to reduce the training side of things, and an active rest phase is much more appropriate. And that is at even a lower volume. There's barely any training in it at all than a resensitization phase. And it absolutely does resensitize you to volume to a very significant extent, but at the price of being very low in training volume. So if you finished a hard diet and you really just want to get right back into the gym and start training somehow, active rest really isn't your best move psychologically, but physiologically it accomplishes a lot of really great things. And I'll say this, some advanced athletes are so strong that for them, a maintenance phase at heavier weights is just not a smart move because their joints won't be able to handle it. So sometimes for them, active rest becomes the phase that's better, because active rest really allows you to ease up on the joint connective tissue side of training and really get a lot out of that after it restarts. Because like if you're usually benching in the 400s or something and squatting in the 600s, man, you're just going to have to back away from heavy weights altogether for a few weeks here and there. You can't just switch to powerlifting style training and say you're resensitizing. At the muscular level you are, at the joint connective tissue level, you're just digging yourself a bigger hole. So advanced athletes have more of a pulsatility to their training, where they're either going really hard or they're hardly going at all. Beginners and intermediates have more of a wave-like structure, where there's times that go harder, times that go easier, but still all of it's fundamentally pretty stimulative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How often do you feel that it's like reasonable to be taking sort of these types of phases, right? Resensitization or
Yeah, like twice a year, so for beginners, once in their beginner career, like once every 2 years or something, which is to say once.
Yeah.
And then for intermediates, like once a year is a good thing. Like if an intermediate takes 2 weeks away from the gym once a year, I'm pretty happy with that. And maybe if they take 2 phases during that time of a few weeks of low volume between high volume phases, each lasting their own 5.5 months, I think that's great. For advanced lifters, it's really at that point you should know your body well enough for there to be more of an as needed recommendation. But to be honest, for advanced lifters, at least 2 resensitization and or active rest phases a year is typically a good idea, which means like for a competitive bodybuilder, it would be like after you do your show and then you do a little bit of a rebound. You go to the gym, you eat lots of donuts, you get crazy pumps, you take awesome pictures, it feels great. Then you get really tired because you realize you just did a whole fat loss diet and a ton of training. So a month after your show or something, do an active rest is a great idea. And then after that active rest, you weave your training back in and you start doing muscle gain training. You do that for multiple months. Then at the end of that muscle gain phase, the next thing is the next fat loss phase for the next show, right? And then, or hypothetically, you want to come in, and this is a big important point, you want to come into that next show prep fresh. You don't want to be carrying the fatigue from your whole mass phase into your cutting phase. You want a cutting phase to start off like a real clean slate. So not only did you take an active rest before your mass phase, but now you took an active rest at the top of your mass phase to get ready for your cut phase to go back down. So that's just like a real I think a real solid approach, and that results in 2 to 3 of these things throughout the average training year for a bodybuilder. And I think that's a really good idea. One thing is people get really scared of these because it feels like you're doing nothing, and in effect you're doing hardly anything at all, and they feel like they lost a sense of purpose. And a lot of us are addicted to exercise, let's just be honest, and you don't get that addiction fed. I have two responses to that. One, somebody's truly interested in optimal, knows what it takes, and does it anyway. Like, shut up. I know you don't like active rest, but it's not up to you. It's up to the optimum results, and the results say that you're supposed to be doing this. And the other thing is, a lot of people who really complain about active rest phases, that complaining is a sign that they're not training hard enough during their actual accumulation phases and primary training blocks. If you put it in hard to a mass gaining block, you're going to want an active rest. If you're of average psychology or even above average psychology, you're going to earn that shit for yourself to the point where you're so done psychologically with training at the end of a muscle gain block, you don't ever want to see the gym again. Not 2 weeks later, you're going to be addicted to the gym again and just can't wait to go. But there's that balance. You know, it's almost people that if you get bored during your weekend, you're probably just not working hard during the week. You know, like I've seen a lot of people get bored during weekends and complain that, oh, the weekend, oh, it's so long. And none of them have been medical doctors, for example, especially like, you know, when residents get a weekend. My wife is a fellow right now. You know, when she was in residency and she got actually, what is that, like a golden weekend where they actually leave you alone. You know, she was never like, oh man, I'm so bored. She just slept for 19 hours a day and then just relaxed the other 4 or whatever. And that was great because like she really earned it, you know? So the same way in training, when people say like, man, I hate deloads, it's like, let me see your training. I bet you're not training hard enough. And a lot of times that really is the case.
Mm-hmm. I guess one question I've had about this kind of manipulation is there an could there be an argument for sort of getting the fatigue dissipation or recovery and the resensitization just from deloads, or sort of trying to do it within the mesocycle time frame?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of validity to that. As you get bigger and stronger, it's just not enough. And if you're pushing yourself appropriately hard, it's just not enough. On a personal note, most of the people that say that out loud in social media just are not big and strong enough for it to be a concern. And for their situation, they are correct. That doesn't mean they're correct for everyone. And another group of those people does not train hard enough, consistently enough to require an active rest. So the active rest phase is something you take only and ever on a needs basis. There's not like this philosophy of active rest. It's like, well, it's a good idea. You know? It's that if you train hard enough and you are muscular and large enough and you push your body to its limits enough, you will organically discover that 2 weeks of deload, which is essentially what an active rest phase is, or a week of deload and a week off, is something you will need because you'll try. Look, like I never want to do active rest. Of course, I just want to train all the fucking time. But at some point, you're going to get in the situation where you've deloaded and then you start another block. And then halfway through that first meso, you're like, I'm done. My elbows hurt again. I can't believe it. But you should have believed it because your elbow still felt weird at the end of a deload. Now, at the end of an active rest, it would have been completely healed and you would have bought yourself another 5 months of training. So to those people that want to just deload it away, I say, if you can do it, amazing, do it. But you will soon realize as you get more advanced and push yourself appropriately hard that you cannot do it in many cases. And then the active rest thing is something that opens up as a requirement to having you. It's kind of like, I would say, you know, can I sleep just 7 hours a day? Because I think 8 is a waste of an hour of my time. If you can, you can. But if you can't, it becomes very apparent, and then you will learn that no, that is the case. And then someone will say, hey, like, do you want to go running tomorrow at 7 a.m.? And you say, let's do 8 a.m. because I got to get my 8 hours. And they can say, well, do you really need 8 hours? And you can look them straight in the face and go, yes. From countless hours of experimentation, countless weeks and days, I can tell you if I push it to 7, I start to break apart. If I go to 8, I'm fine. And then that's how you know what you know.
Yeah, the sleep thing hits home. It's like
Yeah, right?
I need like 8.5 hours, and like in the medical field, you know, you like see all these they call it the sleepless elite, you know, who neurosurgeons who like function on like 5 or 6. or less.
But you can't become them through willpower, you know. That's the thing, is like the sleepless elite are the people who are just genetically gifted to be able to do that. You go, these aren't the people that you would hope neurosurgeons aren't people pushing themselves beyond their sleep capability. I sure as hell wouldn't want a motherfucker operating on my brain when he's
Yeah,
underslept.
exactly.
He's like, which neuron connects between the amygdala, whatever, amygdala, medulla, same thing. So you know, just because somebody can doesn't mean you can or should. I'll tell you this, some of the world's most great thinkers and accomplishers and poets and artists and inventors, and they slept like 10 hours a night, and generally didn't do a whole lot with their lives other than creating vast works of value for humans to consume. And you would say, man, you know, like, that's not the model person. Yeah, but they're brilliant and they're doing amazing work. So that's good enough. You know, so we have a temptation to see people who are capable of great things in a really constrained environment and think like, I need to be like that. No, you need to find the formula for yourself with rest and recovery and life balance that makes you the most productive you can be. Like, you know, whatever, I'll take myself as an example. This is obviously quite egotistical, but I'll run with it. You know, I'm supposed to be an accomplished or whatever, some kind of leader in the field, you know, fine, great. Well, what an honor, right? I sleep 8 to 9 hours a night. And you know, my expertise in anything other than my field that's not deeply intellectual is like nil. Like if I played Jeopardy about, like, you know, the last 5 years of pop singers, I would get everyone wrong. You'd be like, I thought this guy knew stuff. Well, no, that's not part of my job. So a lot of times we see savants that are capable of so many things and they don't sleep, and we go, there's something to learn here. There's just nothing to learn. They're just, that's who they are, and they can do shit like that. You know what I mean? Like, imagine, you know, catching Michael Jordan in his prime and being like, hey, can you do this, fill out this tax form? And he'd be like, I have no idea how to fill out a tax form. Be like, oh my God, my respect for you just went out the window. You know, we respect neurosurgeons for their ability to fix people's brains. Their ability to not sleep, that's only some neurosurgeons. Those are the ones you hear about, you know, and they're the ones you do hear about, because they're the ones that, first of all, they're the ones bragging about it. And second of all, in conversation, it impresses people. Can you imagine, like, if we took a survey of the top neurosurgeons in the world and how many hours of sleep they get, hundreds of them would be getting like 9 or 10 hours of sleep, and like just the only thing they do is neurosurgery and they walk their dog. And like, those aren't the people write books about. Those aren't the people the nurses at the nurses station talk about. Like, oh, did you hear Dr. Franklin gets 10 hours of sleep? They'd be like, that's boring. What an idiot. He's sleeping away half his life. No, you people get to talking about the people that are like, oh my God, did you hear Dr. Franklin only sleeps 3 hours a night? He's so cool. Is there much to take from that? No, he's just a freak. You know?
Pretty much, that's the conclusion I'm gonna tell everyone.
And there's a lot of transfer to bodybuilding with that too, right? Because you see bodybuilders getting away with crazy stuff. Ronnie Coleman supposedly never really slept more than 5 hours a night. Is that a good thing to try? Will that make you Ronnie Coleman? Are you crazy? Yeah, sure, try it. You know, try it. Have my blessing.
Yeah, exactly. Alrighty, so yeah, switching gears a little bit, zooming out to more of the periodization in terms of to include nutrition as well. What are your thoughts on optimal lengths of massing phases in terms of sort of minimum, maximum time frames?
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot of constraint on that, because you can adjust the rate of gain pretty robustly to cover a lot of constraints. What I do think there is a training constraint, and this is something that I've debated a few folks on before. People will say, you know, I'm massing for the next year, and I, in an asshole pedantic way, I'd like to say, no, you're not. And they'd be like, well, yes, I am. Like, no, you're not, because massing is defined, subsumes the category of training hard. But you cannot train hard for a year. You can't. You have to have some breaks in there. At the very least, deloads, but in most cases, some resensitization phases and some active rest phases, lest you not train hard enough. So then once we accept the fact that you can't actually train hard for a year, maybe 6 months, then you say, okay, massing phase is realistically limited to about 6 months. Because remember, massing phase isn't about just presenting a hypercaloric environment and then coasting your training. Massing requires incrementally harder and really, really hard training, which has a time limit of its own. I guess a similar analogy is like, how long can you leave the house for during the day? A long time. What if you're cooking something that's in the oven? well, I don't want to leave the house because it's going to burn, the shit's going to burn down. Or like, 2 hours at most, but I got to be back because there's something in the oven. There's another process going on, which limits the process we're actually talking about. Like, it's not, I don't have to leave the cafe, stop hanging out with my friends because something weird happens when I'm out of the cafe for too long. It's the fact that there's like a cake in my oven that I have to get back to, that's the problem. So the same way, you can hypothetically stretch out a mass. If you start out very lean, and you start out with a very small rate of gain, you can hypothetically on paper mass for a whole year, but you can't sustain that kind of training for a whole year. So it's probably a better idea for you to mass for a slightly shorter amount of time. I would put that number roughly 6 months for people at the top end. And anything less than 2 months probably doesn't cause enough muscle growth to solidify for it to be worth the time. And misses out on the momentum build for strength and competency and exercises and so forth. So I think anywhere between 2 and 6 months is a realistic talk about massing. So if I'm talking to someone and they say, I've got a mass phase coming up, it's going to be 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, I go, oh, cool, that sounds great. Now if someone says, I'm going to be massing for 8 months, my next question is, how are you structuring that? They're like, oh, well, I have a little mini cut in between and a little active rest phase. And then I'm like, oh, that sounds great. That makes a lot of sense. But continuous hypercaloric environment for longer than 6 months leaves me questioning. And much over 6 months, there's another problem too, even just in the nutritional front, where if you are trying to gain muscle for longer than 6 months and you're trying to not get too fat, your rates of gain per week have to be so low that they become difficult to detect. And there's a very big problem with undetectable rates of weight gain. It's that you could be swimming in place and treading water for weeks on end and not know it. I think there's a very good argument for weight gain rates to be robust enough to be clearly detectable. Not very high, but clearly detectable. I would put that bottom end at 0.25% per week. So if you weigh 200 pounds, I think if your goal is to gain any less than half a pound per week, gee whiz, that's tough to detect. You could be going 3 weeks thinking that you really are gaining weight, but you just had the Chinese buffet a couple times and it busted your salt intake up. So then it turns out if you take those days out, statistically, you gain no weight. And you're like, God damn it. Okay, so I just spent 3 weeks training ostensibly to gain mass, but I wasn't actually presenting a hypercaloric condition. So you want to present enough of a surplus to unequivocally be able to detect a hypercaloric condition presentation through the rise of body weight. This is especially true in natural athletes who have no other recourse. So I think there's something to be said for that. And once you say, okay, I'm gaining at least 0.25% per week, how much of a percent gain do you want maximum? I would say gaining much more than 5% of your body weight in the course of a mass gaining phase starts to risk like some pretty serious fat accumulation towards the end, right? So, what does that give us? That's 0.25, that's every 4 weeks we gain 1%, multiplied by 5, that's 20 weeks. That's 20 weeks of massing is, goddamn, that's a lot of massing. And at the lowest rate of gain, that puts you up 5% of your weight, which I would say is starting to flirt with that top end figure. So those are just some figures to consider. 20 weeks is 5 months, 5 months of massing. There you go. There's that 6 month limit. Like at 6 months, yeah, you can fudge it a little bit, but after that, it's like either you're getting too fat or you're trying to gain too slow to cause some risks of not gaining many of those weeks.
Yeah, no, I think I very much agree, actually. My thought is to sort of shoot for that lowest rate of gain that is predictable and detectable and can be achieved, reliably. What's your thought on sort of the upper limit of rate of gain?
It's a really good question. The answer is we actually, through the literature, really just don't know. It turns out there's one factor that we can rely on to ease our minds about how that doesn't have to be a very low bottom end, and here it is. Muscle is a lot more difficult to gain than fat is to lose. Losing fat is just not that hard. Now, losing a lot of fat is very hard, but if you gain an extra 3 or 4 pounds of fat over the course of a muscle gain phase, losing that is just no problem. If you're healthy, you're not grotesquely over fat, it's just not an issue. So then you look at the numbers of how much anabolic stimulus surplus gives you. And the answer is a lot. And the bigger your surplus, to a point, the more anabolic stimulus you get. The harder you can train, the faster you can recover. Think about how much you can train in any given week to benefit and how fast you can recover and thus train more. Now think about adding 300 calories to your daily diet and what those numbers look like. Well, you probably recover from more and train harder. You say, yeah, but there's a risk of fat gain. The thing is, fat gain is fixable. There's a temptation in much of the fitness industry, and unfortunately much of the evidence-based fitness industry, which I think comes from fat phobia, plain and simple. People don't want to get an excess fat because they just don't like to look fat. So then they like to evidence-based pretend their way into the lowest possible rate of gain is what I want. Okay, but you could actually get a net faster rate of gain with no additional weight loss if you simply sped up your rate of gain during your mass gain and then made time for a mini cut at the end to drop that excess fat. I think that there might be some merit to that. So I would say gains of up to 0.5% per week, I don't see an issue with for most folks, and especially for hard gainers. That might be the only way they get the raw anabolic stimulus of that much food to push their training into that stratospheric of a height to make a whole lot of good gains. I think people who are doing more of the gaintaining approach end up with a whole lot of nothing, and people who do a bit more of a forceful approach can gain a lot of stuff. And also we know from a good bit of literature that muscle gain, once it happens, is relatively difficult to get rid of or lose by accident. So there is even more of an impetus there theoretically to really push it and then back off versus try to spread that process out where you never really push it, but you never really have to back off. For beginners and stuff, that works great. For more advanced folks, maybe not. So people a lot of times say when you're a beginner, you can gain at a higher rate of gain than an advanced. This is not so clear to me that that's the case. Maybe. You certainly gain less fat as a beginner, but as an advanced, gaining more fat might simply have to be the transient price you pay for actually gaining much of any muscle at all. It just might take that big of a surplus to get your body to wake up and go, fine, I'll put on muscle. A slower, lower surplus might not allow you to get to the training volumes, intensities, and aptitudes for recovery that really allow you to push your body to its potential. So, that for a 200-pound person, 0.5% is roughly a pound a week. If someone tells me they weigh 200 pounds and getting a pound a week, I don't have a big problem with that. Much after that, pound and a half, et cetera, 1.25 pounds, I'm like, I think you're just getting fat as a hobby. And also at that point, the extra food might start interfering with your training. You get sick. You can't eat during leg days because you throw up. Your back starts to cramp, stuff like that. Health-wise, it's not great. But I think anywhere, I'm very interested in a conversation between 0.25% a week and 0.5% a week. I'm not so interested in conversations outside of that because I don't really mean this is more of a joke, but at some level it's true. People who are trying to gain it slower than 0.25 per week or faster than 0.5 are engaged in some kind of fuckery that is trying to rationalize some other practice that is outside the realm of optimality. Like the real reason you want to gain slow is because you're afraid of being fat. Admit it. And they're like, yeah, okay. But the real reason you're trying to gain fast is because you love chocolate chip cookies and you want to eat as many of them as possible now. And it's like, yep, that's it. Or you don't want to follow macros. You just want to eat pizza. Like, cool, whatever, or you're impatient and you just want it now. None of those are good reasons from an optimality perspective, and I think optimality really sits very likely between 0.25 and 0.5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds really good. In terms of the nutritional aspect and when that drives us to then go into fat loss phases, what are your thoughts on frequency of mini cuts versus sort of longer fat loss phases?
So mini cuts are only really designed for two things. One, to get rid of some of the excess fat you've gained in the last mass phase, and two, to resensitize you, especially appetite-wise, for the next mass phase to come. Mini cuts are designed to be very aggressive because you want to rebound. Fat loss phases are designed to minimize rebound. So I think that you can get away with mini cuts for 2 to 3 of them in a row until you've accumulated so much excess fat that only a real long cut would do to bring you back to normal. So if you start at 10% body fat, you go up to 13, mini cut takes you to 12. You go up to 15, mini cut takes you to 13. You go up to 17, mini cut takes you to 15. Well, 15 is your top end anyway in that sort of theoretical realm. So now another mini cut's just not going to cut it. Now you need to take a maintenance, and by then you've been massing for some time, just a few deloads and mini cuts here and there, maybe. So you're very fatigued, very resistant to hypertrophy. Now it's maybe time to do a slight active rest and then do a fat loss phase that lasts a conventional amount of time, 8 to 12 weeks. You do a 10-week fat loss phase, and then now you're back to Well, like 10% body fat, and then you really clean the slate to really start gaining muscle again, and then you're good to go. So I think 2 or 3 mini cuts typically work pretty well. After that, you're using a weapon that's just not big enough for the job, and you need to take the time to use a longer cut.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Yeah, so keeping mindful of the time, I think I won't take up too much more. I know you have a lot of things to do, Mike. Thanks so much. This has been a very, very enlightening conversation.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. I thought they're really, really great questions you asked. I rarely get questions in that level of depth.
Yeah, I think this has been a conversation looking forward to a lot. One fun question from my audience is just why do you do what you do, Mike?
Grow an obscene amount of body hair and then appear shirtless on television. I'm just kidding. Why, why do I do what I do? Then probably the best answer is passion. I'm just obsessed. I'm obsessed with muscle growth. I look at a picture of a pro bodybuilder, and my number one thought is, that's so cool. And my number two thought is, how can we optimize that even more to make it freakier? That's really it. I look at my own body like that. I look at everyone else's body like that. And so it's kind of like, like, I don't know, it's like a Star Wars reference of like, someone sees like an Imperial cruiser. Many people, it elicits fear. Many people, it elicits awe. In a starship designer, it elicits like, wow, that's amazing. I wonder how we can make that bigger and better. That's how I see myself with regard to physique development, is an obsession with pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I just remember watching this video video of you on Worth and Purpose.
Uh,
And I was just like, man, like I'm getting chills. Like I'm kind of scared right now.
yeah, you know what's
But I
funny?
love it.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, so the Worth and Purpose video, which is it's on YouTube, it's on the RP YouTube. That video, we just chose to present a side of myself. We all have many different sides, and a lot of the feedback on the video is like, "Wow, this guy's a humorless asshole." And it's like, if you've seen any other videos of me, you're like, "That's not true. He's an idiot who makes tons of jokes that aren't even funny." So that is absolutely one side of myself, is that kind of psychotic part. But there's plenty of other positive parts. We're all complex people, I think.
Alrighty. Yeah. So for the audience, Mike, where can they find you?
Best place is YouTube now. Renaissance Periodization on YouTube. Type in Dr. Mike RP YouTube. We're putting out at least three super in-depth content videos a week. Get on there, and if you want to look at the app or look at the Instagram, all those links are available through our YouTube.
All right, great. I'll link those in the show notes below.
Awesome.
Thanks for being on, Mike.
Thanks for having me.